Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. Last week we talked about how many Israelites left Egypt. This week we're going to talk about who left Egypt, because as we'll find out, it was not just Jewish people. It was not just the descendants of Abraham who left Egypt. And we're going to be reading today from verse 38 and then skipping to verses 43 to 49 because they go together. Verse 38 tells us who leaves and includes foreigners in that leaving. And then verses 43 to 49 give ritual instructions, because if there are going to be foreigners, then we have to know how do they relate to the covenant and how do they relate to the ongoing celebration of the Passover. And so that ritual instruction comes here rather than earlier, because earlier there was no talk of foreigners leaving Egypt. This is the place where we need to know, how do we handle foreigners if we're ancient Israel? So I'm going to read from my translation, beginning in verse 38. A mixed crowd went up with them, with flock and herd, heavy droves of livestock. And then skipping down to verse 43, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of Pasach. No child of a foreigner may eat it, but every person's servant hired with silver, when he has circumcised him, then he may eat of it. An immigrant day laborer may not eat of it. In one house it must be eaten. Do not bring any of the meat outside. Its bone you must not break. The whole congregation of Israel shall do it. If an immigrant migrates with you and makes Pasach to Yahweh, let every male circumcise himself, and then he may approach to do it. He will be like a full citizen of the land, but no one uncircumcised may eat of it. There will be one instruction for the full citizen and for the immigrant who migrates into your midst." All right, so this feels like a very significant week in history, in world history, for us to be talking about who qualifies as a full citizen of the land. In verse 38, it says a mixed multitude went up with the people, a mixed crowd went up with the sons of Jacob. And in Hebrew, that phrase is Erev Rav. Erev Rav. It's a mixed crowd, and that the language of mixed crowd might be an intentional wordplay with the word for Hebrew, which is Ivri. So Ivri, Erev Rav, has the same consonants, and they're just scrambled around. And so that may be a possible motivation for describing these people this way. We don't know how many there were. We don't know what nationalities they were, what ethnic background they had. But what we do know is that when the Israelites left Egypt, they were not alone. Others had decided to join them. As we continue to read through the Torah, we'll come across many passages that refer to the presence of foreigners among the people of Israel. Here are some examples: Leviticus 24:10, Numbers 11, verse 4, Deuteronomy 29, verse 11, and Joshua 8:35. Feel free to look those up on your own. You can pause the video and look them up to see what I'm talking about. The ticket to full participation in the ritual life of Israel, in their festival calendar, is the circumcision of males. Females were not circumcised in Israel, but they were associated with the covenant by their association with circumcised males. So if you're a woman, you're included in the covenant. If you're married to a circumcised male, if your father is a circumcised male, if your son is a circumcised male. So women were still fully included, provided they were associated with men who were full-fledged covenant members. Notice that exclusion from the Passover meal is not on the basis of blood or ethnicity, but solely on the basis of covenant status, which is signaled by circumcision. There's a mention of servant in this passage. Some translations say slave. Slave is not a good translation of the Hebrew word eved here, because Exodus 21 verses 2 through 11 offers strict guidelines to prevent the exploitation of hired workers. No human trafficking is allowed. And so the payment that's made when it says to buy a servant or to we could translate it hire a servant. The payment is to the workers themselves or to their families. Human trafficking is prohibited. Notice that temporary hired workers may not participate. If you're just temporarily living among the Israelites, this celebration is not for you because you have not permanently identified with the people of God and with the God who has rescued them. The instruction in verse 46 not to bring any of the meat outside the house is a little bit intriguing. What could be meant by this? It seems to me to symbolize the exclusivity of the covenant. You can't sneak the benefits of the covenant to those outside the house who've not fully participated. Only those who are safely inside the house with the blood painted on the doorpost are safe from destruction. And so those who will in the future celebrate this festival need to also be inside the house. It's somewhat like what we see in Genesis chapter 7, verse 16, when Noah and the animals and his family come into the ark and the door is shut. That shut door is a symbol of the protection inside and the destruction outside. And by bringing everyone into one household, it reinforces the community bond. This is not a celebration that's meant to be individualistic or one family or one small family by themselves. It's meant to bring people together, and it's meant to be celebrated in community. A modern day analogy to this is the celebration of communion, which is open to anyone who believes in Jesus as their Messiah. But it's not permitted to participate in communion if you have not put your faith in Jesus. So it's inclusive to anyone who wants, but it's not something to be done casually or lightly. It's only those who've entered into that covenant. The whole congregation is to participate, which is probably why the whole animal is used. They're not supposed to break any bones because that would fracture or symbolize the fracture of the animal, and it's meant to bring the community together as one. This, of course, has a correspondence to the death of Jesus in the New Testament. John 19, verses 31 to 36, carefully tells us that not one of Jesus' bones was broken because he symbolizes this Pesach lamb. Verses 48 to 49 tells us again that circumcised foreigners are full citizens. They're to be treated as full citizens of the land. This is a radical departure from the experience the Israelites had in Egypt, where there was a two-class system where some were the underdogs and they were exploited by those in power. That is not to be the case in ancient Israel. The Israelites were to fully embrace foreigners as full citizens, provided they were circumcised. Leviticus 19:34 later reinforces this by saying that you're to treat foreigners as you do the native born. There's not going to be any second-class citizens in Israel. Ezekiel 47, verse 22, goes as far as to say that there is land inheritance available for foreigners. That's a new development in Ezekiel's prophecy. One last thing to note is that there's no expectation of ritual purity for those who participate in this first Passover, although we'll see in Numbers 9, verses 6 through 13, that future generations would have to attend to the question of ritual purity in order to celebrate the Passover. But this first time, everybody gets to leave at the same time, and therefore everybody gets to celebrate the Passover at the same time, regardless of their status in terms of ritual purity. They haven't arrived at Sinai yet, and so they don't yet know the rules for ritual purity. And so God does not hold them accountable for rules he hasn't given them yet, which is a beautiful thing. I hope this has given you things to think about this week as we think about land inheritance, inclusion in the people of God, and this beautiful multinational family that God is building around his own character as Redeemer and Rescuer. Have a great week.